research. Both those departments have strong research productivity. And thanks to Dr. Takalkar, our co-director of research in the department, she brought Kelly here today to talk us about what she does and the importance of research.
So I did research at LSU for about 10 years. First in the Department of Neurology, coordinating with cardiology, then into psychopharmacology where we did mostly psychiatric. And I was asked to come because there's some confusion about research here at LSU and the purpose of doing it. So it's pretty short and concise. Most of you are familiar with retrospective chart reviews. I think that's what a lot of you are doing. That's probably, in simplest terms, the research that most will do. Expedited IRB review. Any research done anywhere must be IRB reviewed. So if you're at an academic institution, most of them have local IRBs. There are also sponsor central IRBs. When you leave, go into different hospitals, some of them will require research also. That's the least amount of regulatory requirements. I know Janice has been here talking a lot about research and what's needed. Has everybody done retrospective chart reviews in here or are on them at some point? Okay, because I think, Dr. D, is it a requirement for your residents? Okay. Investigator initiated can be expedited or full board depending on what it's over and covering. Most investigator initiated needs some kind of institutional or departmental review prior to IRB submission. That's going to be where you write the protocol, you carry out the research. It has moderate regulatory requirements. It is most likely going to be full board. It is not going to be as simple as an expedited review. However, it's also not going to be as difficult or as time consuming.
Let me give you.
Hear me? Not going to be as difficult or time consuming as the sponsor or the federally initiated ones. All your sponsor and federal initiated will go before full board IRB. They will have full regulatory requirements, which will include 1572s, investigator brochures, and all of those requirements. I know you guys are in radiology and there's several different study structures. The easiest ones to get into are diagnostic imaging, what we call one and done. You'll bring a patient in, you'll have them consent, you'll do a scan, whether it's SPECT, PET, MRI, CT. Read the scan per a specific protocol. There's a lot of ACRN, which is the radiology ones, mostly dealing with oncology at this point. But I was looking and there's a lot of PTSD and compulsive behavior studies that are being done with SPECT. I found a couple with CT and MRI, but not a lot. These are gonna be more minimal time requirements. If you're first breaking into research, these are the easiest ones to get into. Your IRB is gonna be about the same regardless, but you're not gonna have the follow-up, you're not gonna have the events, you're not gonna have the data capture that you're gonna have with a lot of other ones. These one and dones are typically where you get the new compounds. So for PET, SPECT, any kind of thing like that. There's diagnostic imaging with follow-through, typically has a disease process. You'll have an initial scan and then subsequent scans after that. You'll have, depending on what your role is, you'll have additional patient visits and data collection. Again, depending on your role, it could be minimal to moderate time. A lot of these are your neurological or your psychiatric studies, Alzheimer's, things like that. Then you got the diagnostic imaging and therapy, which is more intensive. That's going to involve subsequent scans, more than one typically. You've got your therapies. For radiology, these are typically done in collaboration with either other departments in LSU or with community members. Depending on your role, whether you hold the PI or whether you hold the sub-I, will determine your time requirements. If you hold the PI, it's going to be more intensive. If you hold the sub-I, which would typically mean you're going to read the scans, you're going to make assessments, that's going to be more on the moderate side. You will need to know your protocols on all of them, but again, the time constraints will vary from one to another. So if you're looking at getting into research, we always suggest starting in the diagnostic imaging. You won't need as much help. I think Janice has pretty much gone over a lot of this with you, but the principal investigator holds responsibility for all studies. The conduct of the study, adherence to the protocol, they have to make sure that their staff is trained and qualified. So they can delegate what they think you're qualified for. Maybe a physical exam, maybe obtaining EKGs, it could be just reading. If you hold the PI, you're responsible for your staff and everybody on that study. Sub-investigator does a lot of the legwork. They can do, again, if you're qualified, the same as the PI, but you're not accepting primary responsibility. You're still held to the ethical standards. You're still held to all the requirements, but you're not held accountable for the study in the FDA's eyes, just your part in it. Your study coordinator, and I can't stress this enough, is probably your most important person. Whoever you have as your study coordinator, they're the ones that are going to keep you out of trouble. If you're staying at LSU or an academic institution, typically your study coordinator will encompass all three of these. They'll do your regulatory, they'll do your patient stuff, they'll do your data entry. They'll be responsible for making sure that everything is conducted appropriately so you stay out of trouble. Okay? If you're just starting out and you're doing like the expedited chart reviews or you're doing the one and dones, most of the time you won't have a study coordinator. It's fairly minimal. If you're doing any kind of extended, the suggestion is you have your study coordinator. They'll work closely with you, and if they're good, they'll have you oversign everything. The reason they do that is to show audit oversight. The FDA, the IRB, whoever's going to come in and check your stuff, you want them to know you know what's going on in your study. So they'll have you oversign everything. The data management coordinator, there are very few institutions, usually it's going to be like the Mayo Clinic, where the study coordinator will hand off and say, enter this. Most of the time you'll have either a regulatory coordinator and a study data together, or one person will do all three. Okay, again, I know Janice has gone over this, but this is where Angela's going to be asking you for CVs. They have to be, if you're doing any kind of research in your regulatory binder, they have to be current. Current by FDA standards means within 2 years. So over at our site, I have all of my doctors, everybody sign a new CV pretty typically every year. So when we have new studies come in, I'm not running to each doctor going, I need you to sign a new one. It does not have to be original unless the sponsor requires it. It does, however, have to be updated. Some sponsors will say as long as it's within 2 years of the start of the study, you're fine. Some auditors will require it every 2 years, regardless of the length of the study. So that's something to be aware of when your coordinator, once you're out of residency, or Angela in residency is saying, I need a CV, it's probably for a study. We get CVs and I just make copies for every study. That way my doctors aren't signing 45 of them. Current copy of the med license has to be in the regulatory. The FDA will jump all over you if it's 1 day out. So again, this is where you're going to rely on your coordinator to keep up with this stuff. If you know you're getting a new license, you just send it in, it's not a big deal. Research requires that you have GCP training. Now, LSU is very specific about, they want CITI training, and I think everybody in here has done it. It's about a 3-hour process. It's good for 3 years, so it's not something that you have to repeat all the time. When you're out in other hospitals, when you're doing research for standalone imaging facilities, FDA just says you have to have GCP training. It doesn't specify city. So the NIH training, about 2 hours, it doesn't cost anything. The OHARP training is a series of YouTube videos that go through consent process, so you can kind of piecemeal it to see what it is. Depending on your sponsor and or your IRB, so our IRB says, at LSU says, city every 3 years. There are some institutions, if you do overreads or something for other institutions, that may require it more often. So it's institution dependent. The FDA says as long as it's current and it does not give a standard for current at this time, you're fine. Delegation log is appropriated by the PI. It is who he assigns to do what tasks. It is, even if it is a retrospective chart review, you must have a delegation log. It shows who's working on the study. Then, of course, your protocol and your IRB approval documentation. Whether it's expedited or regular, all research must be IRB approved. Those are your basic essential documents. Now, depending on what the study is, you may have 1572s, you may have financial disclosures, investigator brochures, on-label sites, anything like that. If you're doing a more extensive study, your study coordinator will typically take care of this stuff for you. They'll bring it to you, they'll sign it. If they're good, they'll have a checklist to show you this is what's done. This is what the IRB auditors will come in and look at. This is what the FDA auditors will come in and look at. Essential regulatory documents is their big hotspot. Okay, so the how to research, getting into research outside of expedited chart reviews. The things you want to consider are your time constraints, both as an individual, what the department time constraints are, and what the institutional time constraints are. If you're working CT and MRI and you're overreading, are you going to expect to do a study with 40 patients in 2 weeks and have that scanner time or whatever available to you? Are you going to be working evenings or that type of thing? When you're talking about research, you're doing available resources. The equipment, your backup people in case you're out sick, the space, and not necessarily the space to do the scans, but you have to have the regulatory binders, you have to have consent forms, you have to have all of these things. You need the space to house them. FDA says they have to be locked because a lot of it holds patient information. So that's something to pay attention to. And then your personal strengths and qualifications and your areas of interest, both the imaging modality and the field of study. So right now a hot topic is concussions in football, and that's a big research area. If you can put together a protocol and you can show purpose, you could pretty much get funding for that section at this point. So you need to determine what your areas of interest are when you're thinking about research. If coming from neurology and coming from psychiatry, we already had strong research programs in place. If you're looking at starting a research program and you don't know where to go, there's a couple of places you can kind of start at. There's several, I used to call them farming sites, where Clinical Connection is one of them, where you go and you register and you say, this is my area of expertise, this is my area of whatever. And anytime a study hits, they'll send it to you. Is this something you're interested in? If you're not, you just delete it. If you are, you can start going through the process. Clinicaltrials.gov is a pretty basic and standard website. It lists all clinical trials in the U.S. that have been completed or that are ongoing. It's meant more as a resource for patients or people looking for clinical trials. However, starting out, you can find pharmaceutical companies or government things that are doing studies and approach and say, here, we've got the qualifications, we've got everything. Do you need help in recruitment? Don't assume that because the study's been going on 2 or 3 years, they don't need more sites. Some studies are competitive in enrollment, where you enroll as many as you can. The cap is 275, and if one site gets 150, that's how it is. A lot of sites are capped at a certain number because they want the diversity, they want the demographics. So a lot of times you can go on clinicaltrials.gov, you can go to Alzheimer's and CT scans, or PTSD and SPECT scan, and it'll list all of the studies that are going on. You click on it, you find out who's running it, you contact that pharmaceutical company. there are many standalone physician sites in Shreveport, Bossier that are doing research that desperately need radiology collaboration. Breathe America is one that does all different kinds of studies. Desperately need radiology collaboration. Need a place for CT, need a place for MRI, need a place for SPEC. And if you're research ready, meaning we're not waiting for you to do the 3-hour CT scan, we're not asking for 4 or 5 months to please give us your CV, you'll be getting people through the door. So it's a good thing to think about. The one thing to be aware of is some of the community institutions only go with sponsor IRBs, so some of them won't consider LSU unless it's paid by. So if it's not protocol specific, if they just need a CT scan, they may come to you. If it's going to be protocol specific, meaning they need it done this way, this how, this time parameter that's out of clinical standards, it's going to be a little dicier because of the IRB. Okay, but I can tell you up front from radiology that it's just on the desperate line of needing radiology people. So this is one of the reasons they wanted me to come up, was to pitch research to you. Okay, there's obviously the medical advances, and that's kind of the gold standard of we all do research because. Okay, but there's also the sidelines of the publications and the networking. A lot of times, especially with sponsor studies in the radiology side, it's a very small, tight-knit group. And so when you go to these meetings, you're networking throughout. You're going to find more studies that way. You're going to find more opportunities that way. You're also going to find different ways of doing things. Depending on institutional standards and expectations, right now you're at LSU. If you're planning on going on to another academic institution or something along those lines, most will require you to do some sort of research or be involved in some sort of research. So it's nice that you can go in and say, I've got the basics in. If you're looking at a private clinic working at something like Ashley Ridge, a standalone imaging facility, something like that, it's a good way to get extra patients through the door. It's a good supplemental income. The big thing is we don't do research for money, and that's true. There are other reasons to do research, but to get patients through the door, to get the supplemental income through the door, and with the radiology, again, with the diagnostics, you're working on, a lot of our patients have come from TV and from radio advertisements, where the study provides that stuff to you. So it's not just institutional people you're seeing. We did a study in psychiatry that linked with the PET center. And the patient had never been to LSU. They actually got in the study through a brochure, I think. It's been 6 years. A brochure. And at the PET center, they had a PET scan done at a different institution. And then after this PET center here, it was, if we have a PET scan, we're going to come back here. And we've seen that both with CT and MRI too. So whether you're looking at institutional, a lot of people have choices. And if you've got the choice to go to, if you've set the basis with research and how you're doing stuff, you can get even clinical patients coming back through the door. So outside of the run-of-the-mill, I'm doing this for medical advances or whatever, there's a lot of personal reasons to be involved in research. If you've got a good study structure team in place, I'm not going to say it's not work, because it is, but your grunt work is going to be done by your sub-Is, by your study coordinator. And as long as you're overseeing and you're doing those sorts of things, as long as your study coordinator, your sub-Is, whoever they are working with you, you're in good shape. I put this in because I worked with LSU IRB, and I know the HRPP stuff kind of gets overwhelming. Research is really not that difficult to get up and running. Research is really not that difficult to do. If you stay on top of stuff, you set your pace, research is really not as scary as it's made out to be. Okay? And then again, and I mentioned this before, but radiology, there are a lot of studies that people are turning down because they don't have access to what we call study-ready radiology departments, CT scans, anybody like that. So it's a huge service that can be provided both within the institution. As I know in psychiatry, we turned one down because 4 years ago of the wait time between CTs and MRIs. Research is very time specific. If it's not done in 4 or 5 days, you're out of window. So with all of that working through, it makes it much easier to collaborate. Questions? Yes.
To them
Yeah, you got
requiring,
it. I can't
I'm sorry, with regards to them requiring radiology, is it that they only require facilities which can scan patients, or do they also require radiologists to interpret the studies?
Both. But a lot of them are requiring the radiology overreads because a lot of a psychiatry is not going to be able to read a CT scan.
Sure.
So they're needing both the facilities but also the radiologist to read it. That's really a lot of what we're seeing.
That is a good point. The radiology is involved practically in everything that comes out as a research work. What happens, and we are not included. I have, in the past, I asked Glenn Mills to include us, in the publication. I think sometimes Guillermo is included in those, and you may be included in some of them. But every publication has ENT, pulmonology, or whatever, has imaging. Nothing is done without imaging. If you check something like that is happening, please let me know, and I'll be happy to ask whoever is doing it to include a radiologist, or some of you, the residents, can get into it. It is an important, vital experience for all of you, especially at this time of your formation, as a specialist.
Going back to Hussein's question, a lot of studies do require a central read, so you actually send the data by ICOM send or CDs or respite transfer FTPs to a central read that reads and assesses and analyzes the data. But most research studies, the most companies, they also want a local read just for liability issues. So you still have a local radiologist reading because if there are findings that are going to affect the care of the patient, that's not going to come from the center. It's going to come from the radiology. And even though you're doing research, patient safety comes first. So if something needs to be done clinically to take care of the patient, it takes precedence over the research thing, and you may end up taking the patient out of the research, but you have to do the right thing for the patient. So lots of these studies, although you have a central read, a central organization reading the scans, there's still demand on it. So there's always going to be a demand for radiologists to read it.
Yeah, we have several that go to central, but they want a local read just to make sure. Plus, I had a study where they would compare the local reads to the central reads to see what was going on. So, yes, to answer your question, it is the facilities, but it's the techs and the radiologists to read have to be involved. So they're a lot of a protocol. They have to sign off on all the papers and everything.
You need to be familiar with the new criteria that have come up, like RECIST 1.1 or prostate cancer working group 2 criteria or Dulles criteria, those kinds of things. Because most of the studies are wanting you to objectively evaluate the studies. So, you read those things for exam, but down the road they do have practical applications.
Yeah, and some of the studies may require specific, resist for oncology that you mentioned that. So, but it's very interesting and it keeps you at the forefront.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Kelly. You mentioned some staff, list of people to work on the research team. I don't know, from my limited experience, it appears that may be necessary in order to make research as easy as it should be. Does this depend on the number of you answer it once, and then somebody says, that's not how to do it. You go back and sit down for 2 hours, somebody walks you through, and I'm talking from my personal experience. And then you answer it again, and then they ask another question and ask you to reframe it. And okay, there is no data coordinator that is full-time. And you're talking about, being critical of pace that is set, and you can't set personal pace when so many other factors are involved. Do you advise that this is crucial? Because certainly this is one of the things that will deter.
So it's a catch-22 right now because it's a fledgling research program. You're a baby research program, and you've got to start out before you can hire on the extra. So my suggestion is you start out with like the one and dones. And yeah, the regulatory is the most cumbersome. We're working on that. I think the IRB is so concerned with doing everything right and by the books that they're not realizing that it's turning people away from research. And it is something that's being worked on. They're kind of in a growing phase too. So there's not a set number. There's not a magic number of patients, a magic number of studies. If it's a one and done where you're bringing them in, you're consenting them, you're scanning them, you could do 40 patients by yourself with no problem. If it's a longer study, we've got one study where 2 patients is keeping me busy full time, just with that one study in regulatory. So there's not a magic number. We're hoping to help radiology build so that there will come a time where there is a research coordinator. It will probably be a study coordinator that does everything. That's really what happens, and that's what I do even for biomed. That's really kind of how it's going right now because, as you know, the more hands in the pot, the more mistakes make. And when you're PI, you don't want 7 different people doing what one person can do. So it is kind of a catch-22 at this point. Once you get research rolling, once you get several projects up and moving, some of it is a funding issue, some of it is a being able to justify clinical versus research versus we need another person. So initial submissions are probably the hardest thing. When you're first getting the study up and running, that's the most frustrating, dealing with IRB. And I'll say in dealing with other local IRBs, not just ours, and then also dealing with what they call Sponsor Central, everybody's got their quirks. So, but the initial submission is really the biggest issue. Once you get past that, the continuing reviews and stuff, if you haven't done anything majorly wrong, are pretty easy to get through even just by yourself without a coordinator. But yeah, as research picks up, yes, a coordinator is going to be necessary. Does that help?
Something to look forward to.
But you got to start somewhere, and that's really the issue we're at right now, is being able to get the research up and running where you guys can get to a point where you can get a coordinator to help offset a lot of the regulatory and a lot of the stuff like that. Anything else? Okay, Dr. D.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.